Over the weekend, foreign ministers from the so-called G7 countries got together in Hiroshima, Japan. The event included a wreath-laying ceremony at the memorial that marks the atomic bombing of the city by the United States in 1945. It was the first time that a sitting U.S. Secretary of State had visited the memorial site. Meanwhile, the talks included issues like nuclear weapons, efforts at countering terrorism, and the plight of refugees. The group of 7 countries comprises the United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Another G7 meeting involving the nation's leaders will also take place in Japan at the end of May. Major powers like China, Russia, and members of the developing world are not part of the group, and that has led to questions about the relevance of the G7 in today's changing world. Joining me now here in the studio is PJ Crowley. He is a former spokesperson for the U.S. State Department and is a fellow at the George Washington University. With us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is the director of the China National Association of International Studies. Also joining us in Washington is Shihoko Goto. She is senior associate for the Asia program at the Wilson Center. And with us from Providence, Rhode Island is Vladimir Goldstein. He is an associate professor of Slavic studies at Brown University. Welcome to all of you to the studio. PJ, let me start with you. One of the major issues at this G7 foreign ministers meeting has been that of nuclear weapons. They issued a joint statement reaffirming their commitment to build a world without nuclear arms. This was a declaration that was made in Hiroshima. This was the first ever city destroyed by an atomic bomb. How significant was that?
I think it is significant from a symbolic standpoint, obviously, particularly since Secretary of State John Kerry is the highest-ranking U.S. official ever to visit Hiroshima, and obviously the White House is considering, what the president should do and whether he should go there, when he travels to Japan in a couple of months. It also has salience in terms of the current dynamic in the region. North Korea continues to advance its nuclear program, perfect its missile technology. And so obviously it resonates in the region, it resonates beyond, even while the Obama administration, even back to Prague when the president said that there was this vision of a world without nuclear weapons, he acknowledged right away that that's not necessarily something that's going to happen in his lifetime.
Shihoko, as PJ Crowley just pointed out, John Kerry was the first sitting U.S. Secretary of State to visit the Hiroshima Memorial. He did not offer an apology for that attack. Should he have done so?
I don't think it was expected, and I think what he did do was pay great respect, and perhaps more importantly, he showed great empathy towards the victims of the actual bombings. And I think that has really set a really great tone. If Obama does go to Hiroshima next month, as some speculate, then that is something that Obama would be expected to do as well. Of course, some Japanese would argue that that Kerry should have apologized, but that's really not the mainstream opinion of Japan at the moment. If I can just add one more thing, Japan, it really wants to move forward from the legacy of World War II. It's seen this as an opportunity to really be at the forefront of being a pacifist country and to be able to promote itself at the forefront of nuclear disarmament.
Victor, this is the G7 foreign ministers meeting. China is not represented at this meeting. What is China's perspective on these nuclear issues that are being talked about, especially in the light of, as PJ just pointed out, that the nuclear tests and the missile launches that are being carried out by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea?
Well, nuclear weapon, if ever used, should be a major event in world history. And China has taken the position that it will never be the first country to use nuclear weapon, and it will not use nuclear weapon against any non-nuclear weapon state or non-nuclear weapon region in the world. And I think this is a good policy for all the other nuclear weapon states to follow. As far as the DPRK's nuclear weapon program is concerned, China is very much firmly opposed to that program and has joined the United Nations Security Council in its resolution, and China is recently adopting all the measures necessary to implement the United Nations Security Council resolution imposing sanctions on DPRK for its violation of the nuclear weapon program. And we do hope that in human history ever going forward, nuclear weapon will never be used. I am myself a signatory to the Global Zero commitment, which aims at cutting down nuclear weapons in the world all the way down to zero. This is almost a mission impossible, but as an idealism, I think we as mankind should pursue this as a lofty goal.
Vladimir, another country that was not at the table at this foreign ministers' meeting was, of course, Russia. Russia used to be part of the G8, but it was expelled. So one of the things that was discussed, or some of the things that were discussed at this meeting, was the wars in Syria and Iraq, the refugee crisis, as well as the violence in Ukraine. So how does Russia view this when these countries are talking about issues that it's involved in?
Well, Russia obviously feels that it needs to be part of the discussion, and most of the participants understand it. There was a German minister who said that, we should reconsider that Russia to be present. It's obviously a major player on many levels, from political and economic to the issue which your previous guest discussed, that is, nuclear threat and nuclear situation. And I want to sort of revisit the issue for a second. It's very kind of laudable that Secretary Kerry goes there and acknowledges certain things which happened 50 years ago. And that's, U.S. has a very good record of acknowledging their own mistakes which they accomplished 50 years ago. But I don't think they do anything acknowledging in terms of recent events. Maybe now Obama said, yes, that, the war in Libya wasn't particularly correct. So what I'm trying to say is that I find it deeply ironic that in a situation when there are a lot of bases around Russia, where there's, according to many observers, former diplomats, historians, professors, the threat of nuclear confrontation between Russia and US is very strong. I find it ironic that, Secretary Kerry goes to Japan, to Hiroshima, and acknowledges the dangers, but hardly does that much. Neither he nor U.S. president, hardly they do that much to dissolve the current situation, to current sort of predicament. And, rather than sort of engaging Russia and discussing it, the only thing that G8 or G7 did is to expel Russia from the table of conversation. Russia is a big part of Europe. Russia is a big part of world affairs. And, this is hardly an accomplishment.
Another source of tension, and that is what is going on in the South and East China Sea. The ministers issued a statement on maritime security and made reference to a change in the status quo in this particular area. That was an apparent reference to China. And the Chinese foreign minister said that raising this issue would offer no solutions but only damage regional stability. So why raise the issue?
Well, this is just an ongoing agreement to disagree within the context of what's happening in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. China has had a consistent position that this is a matter of bilateral relations, right, between China and its neighbors that are affected by these issues, the Philippines, Japan, and Vietnam, for example. The United States has not taken a specific position as to the merits of these disagreements, other than to say that from a U.S. standpoint, these issues should be resolved through multilateral talks, because it's not just bilateral, it's regional in nature. I think the statement by the G7 foreign ministers just reflects the fact that while this is a regional issue, very significant one, it's one that has global ripple effects, and I mean that I think is where China is still a hybrid nation, if you will. It is obviously the second largest economy in the world. China is a global player, but it is it is still trying to adjust to the how its regional interests have global implications, and the fact that the world is going to take note of when there are tensions in the region that can have ripple effects that affect other nations around the world.
Victor, China does not think that this should be a multilateral issue, as PJ points out. It notes that neither Japan nor any other member of the G7 is relevant or a relevant party to the dispute. In fact, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Liu Kang said, "We urge G7 member states to honor their commitment of not taking sides on issues involving territorial disputes." What do you make of that statement coming out of the G7?
Well, first of all, China is very unhappy about the G7 foreign ministerial statement about South China Sea and the East China Sea. China sees this as a provocation and sees the statement as very unconstructive in helping achieving a peaceful resolution of the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Indeed, there are territorial disputes between China and the Philippines and between China and Vietnam. And also, from the Chinese perspective, there is territorial dispute involving Diaoyu Island between China and Japan. And these are the facts. However, for other countries, especially those beyond this part of the world, they need to urge for diplomacy and negotiation rather than picking sides of one side against the other, because otherwise the G7 foreign ministers meeting will be considered by China at least as being unhelpful and unconstructive. Now, as far as the merits of these claims are concerned, China's position is very consistent, and China's position about the South China Sea dates all the way back to the 1940s, as well as way beyond that. And the Chinese claim about the Diaoyu Island and the dispute with Japan about the Diaoyu Island also dates back to the unconditional surrender of Japan at the end of the Second World War. You mentioned about the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I would say that these bombings were a result of the Japanese aggression and refusal to accept the unconditional surrender. And when we talk about these two nuclear bombings in Japan, we need to put this in historical perspective. No person in this world will forget why President Truman of the United States did the unthinkable of dropping the two bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And future generations should also see this in this correct historical perspective.
Okay, let me get Shihoko's response to that. Shihoko, was this bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki the result of Japan's refusal to accept unconditional surrender?
I think no U.S. government official has said that Japan deserved what it got. What we saw yesterday with John Kerry laying the wreath and paying his respects to those who were victims of the bombings demonstrates the fact that these were unfortunate consequences, but there are lasting consequences of these bombings, and that there are other alternatives to reach peace and stability. I want to go back to what was being discussed about the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and that the Chinese perspective that it should remain out of the multilateral front and really focused on the bilateral issue. That really is no longer the case. Legally, it is a bilateral issue, but the consequences of ongoing conflict, or indeed the possibility of outright conflict over the territorial disputes, has global consequences. We've seen, for instance, the release of the IMF Global Economic Outlook report earlier this week. The IMF has again downgraded the World Economic Outlook, in part because of concerns about a British exit from the European Union.
Right.
Now, that in itself is quite significant, because the Brexit has global consequences. Asia is the region that is really holding up the global economy at the moment. Any outright conflict and even continued ongoing conflict today, it has impact on foreign investment, trade relations, everything else.
Okay, Victor, very quick response from you. What happens in the East and South China Sea has global implications. It's not a regional issue.
Whatever China does has global implications, not only as far as these territorial disputes are concerned, but almost in everything that China does or China does not do. We are fully aware of that. But that does not give any other country to have the right to grab land from China. China will strongly defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity, regardless of whatever G7 foreign ministers meetings would issue any kind of a statement. This is the bottom line, and the Chinese people are fully united behind the Chinese government in defending the sovereignty and the territorial integrity.